What's going on, everybody? I'd like to share with you kind of my thought process and really my process for how I went about drawing a portrait of my cat. So here's the image, reference image that I used. And to begin with, I started out with the overall straight line block in and the overall shape of her face. So I started out by determining on my paper where the top of her ears would be and also the overall width of her face. So the right and left sides, outermost edges of her face. I drew these in very light lines, simple lines. From there, I used my pencil and my arm and I measured the width of her face. And the reason to do this is I'm trying to get the proportions correct. So this orange line shows that's the width of her face. Once I have that measurement, I rotated it to be vertical, and I saw if there was any point on her face that I could line it up with. And luckily for me, from the top of her ears to the bottom of her nose is the exact same as the width of her face. So now I could draw a line for the bottom of her nose. So now I could really start getting an understanding. I could really start figuring out the proportions of the rest of the face, at least in that top square there for the width and the height her nose. So that's what I did. I started drawing these straight lines, kind of figuring out where the ears were, this is all kind of guesstimating in the beginning for the most part, except I know where the bottom of her nose is because I know that I have the width of her face that I created. So now I figured out the bottom of her nose, figured out the rest of the face, kind of blocked that in, and also tried to block in the bottom of her chin there. And the way that I checked, okay, where was the bottom of her chin, where's the bottom of her face, I measured the height of her nose. And I tried to line it up around her face, seeing if there was anything that was very similar, very close to that measurement. And it happened to be the same measurement as from the bottom of her nose to the bottom of her chin. So that way I knew exactly where the bottom of her chin was because I knew exactly where the bottom of her nose was. And now I knew where the top of her nose was because it's the same height as from her chin to the bottom of her nose. So I have these measurements, and now I measured on the reference photo the side of her left side of her face, or the right side of her face, to the outer edge of her eye. And I tried to see if there was anything on her face that was similar to that. And the funny thing was, almost all the lines, it could almost go across her face 4 other times. So her eyes are almost the same width as her nose and the outer edge for other eye. So those all kind of lined up, luckily for me. So I was able to figure out all these measurements. I measured the top of her eye to the top of her head, and that was almost the same as the top of her eye to the bottom of the nose. So just by having all these measurements, I can start guesstimating all these proportions. Okay, now I can figure out, okay, the top of her eye is halfway between the top of her head and the bottom of her nose. And I realized that same measurement is much taller than her ears. So now I know her ears are actually smaller than that measurement. So now I just start getting all these proportions correct. Now I block in her nose because I know where the top of that is. I can kind of guesstimate the eyes now because I know where the top of her eyes are. I can start measuring things a little bit more, figuring this out using straight line block in still. And once I have kind of all the straight lines blocked in very lightly, I can clean up the lines, and now I have a very good sense of her face. And all of this, this can take up to an hour or more, depending on what you're drawing, how complicated it can be. This whole process of measuring, getting the proportions, and doing the straight line block in, this can be very challenging. It could take a lot of time. So I don't want to misguide you and say, oh, this is very easy, this is just all the stuff you have to do. But basically, when you learn how to measure and use these straight line block-ins to make curved lines and get these angles correct, your drawings are going to improve over time, and you're going to spend less time fixing things in the end if that's one of your problems. If you tend to get the proportions wrong and you have to fix it over and over, this can be a method to kind of help you with that. And I just wanted to show you guys kind of the process for how I began that drawing, because in the tutorial video it was very hard to see, very light. And I hope this kind of cleared some things up. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you can apply this to your own drawings, and hope you found it helpful. Anyway, Be sure to check out my other tutorial videos for drawing and painting. Also subscribe to see future episodes. Peace.